At first glance, it doesn't look like a military tool at all. It's small, plain, almost disappointingly simple. A short wooden handle, a flat piece of metal at the end, nothing polished, nothing impressive. In fact, if you saw one sitting on a table, you might mistake it for something from a gardening shed. But during World War II, thousands of American soldiers carried one of these every single day. It was called an entrenching tool. Most soldiers shortened the name to something even simpler, the E-tool. And for something so ordinary, it had an unusually constant presence. It rode quietly on the outside of a soldier's field gear, often hanging from the belt or pack. Not hidden, not protected, just there. March after march, day after day. It never made headlines. It never appeared in dramatic photographs. Historians usually talk about tanks, aircraft, and artillery, machines that shaped the visible battlefield. But the E-tool lived in a different world, a quieter one. Because while large weapons changed the course of battles, this small shovel changed something much more personal. It changed how a soldier felt about the ground beneath his feet. That might sound strange at first. After all, digging a small hole in the dirt doesn't seem like an important part of history. But in the uncertain environments soldiers moved through, forests, fields, unfamiliar villages, the ability to shape the earth even slightly could mean the difference between chaos and control. The E-tool gave soldiers something subtle, not power, not dominance, something quieter than that. A sense that even in the middle of an unpredictable war, the ground itself could be made a little safer. And that small feeling of control turned out to matter far more than anyone expected. Because as the war unfolded, this simple tool would quietly become one of the most constant companions an American soldier could carry. Not because it was impressive, but because it helped people survive the long hours between the moments history actually remembers. Most soldiers didn't think of the entrenching tool as equipment. They thought of it as something closer to a habit, something that simply came with the uniform. Every American infantryman during World War II carried one somewhere on his gear, usually hanging from the belt or attached to the back of his pack. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't complicated, and strangely, most soldiers didn't expect to use it very often. At least, not in the way people imagine. Movies sometimes show long trench systems carved across a landscape, but in reality, the small E-tool was usually used for something much simpler, a shallow hole, just enough space in the ground for a single person. Not a fortress, not a bunker, just a small piece of earth that belonged to one soldier for a few hours. And that's where the story becomes unexpected, because the most important thing the entrenching tool provided wasn't protection, it was time. When soldiers stopped moving, even briefly, they would often take out the tool and begin shaping the dirt beneath them. Not because someone ordered it, because experience quietly taught them something. The ground could change faster than the situation around them. A few minutes of digging could transform an exposed position into something calmer, something more controlled. The twist is this. Many veterans later said the digging itself mattered almost as much as the hole. The simple rhythm of metal against soil gave the mind something to focus on, something steady, something predictable. In a war filled with uncertainty, that small action grounded a person, literally and psychologically. The tool wasn't just shaping the earth, it was shaping the soldier's state of mind. And that quiet psychological effect would become one of the most underestimated survival tools an American soldier carried. If you asked an American soldier in World War II what tool kept him alive the longest, many wouldn't say his rifle. They would say his entrenching tool. The folding shovel carried by U.S. troops, commonly known as the M1943 E-tool, looked simple. A short wooden handle, a small steel blade. Nothing impressive. But in the mud, snow, and chaos of war, it became one of the most important survival tools a soldier had. Because the first rule of staying alive under fire was simple. Get low, get covered, get invisible. And that meant digging. The moment artillery started falling, soldiers dropped to the ground and began carving shallow foxholes into the earth with frantic speed. The shovel bit into soil again and again, each scoop buying another second of life. Within minutes, a shallow depression could turn into a life-saving pocket of cover. A foxhole only 2 feet deep could stop shrapnel. 3 feet deep could hide a man completely. And that tiny shovel made it possible. But the entrenching tool did far more than dig fighting positions. It cleared debris after bombings. It helped build defensive trenches. It cut through frozen ground in the Ardennes during the brutal winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge. It even served as a cooking aid. Soldiers sometimes used the blade like a crude frying pan over a fire. Yet perhaps its most unexpected role appeared when soldiers ran out of everything else. No ammunition, no bayonet, no backup. In desperate moments of close combat, the entrenching tool became something else entirely, a weapon. Not officially designed for fighting, but terrifyingly effective when used that way. And that brutal reality would become infamous during some of the most intense fighting of the war, especially in places like Battle of Okinawa and the forests of Europe. Because sometimes survival didn't depend on what you carried, it depended on how far you were willing to use it. There are moments in war when ordinary tools suddenly become something more, not because they were designed that way, but because circumstances leave people with very few choices. During the later years of World War II, American soldiers often fought in environments where visibility was limited and distances were short. Dense forests in Europe, thick vegetation in the Pacific, narrow terrain where encounters could happen with almost no warning. In those conditions, every piece of equipment took on greater importance, including the small entrenching tool hanging from a soldier's gear. One account from the Pacific Theater describes a night when a group of American infantrymen had stopped moving after hours of advancing through difficult terrain. They did what soldiers often did during pauses in movement. They began digging, each man quietly working the soil beneath him, shaping the ground into a shallow foxhole. The rhythm of metal against dirt was familiar by them, almost comforting. But sometime during that quiet work, something unexpected happened. Movement. A sound in the darkness just beyond the tree line. No clear view. No time for long decisions. In that moment, the entrenching tool stopped being just a shovel, not because anyone planned it that way, but because it was already in the soldier's hands. Veterans later recalled that the tool had an unusual advantage in such moments. It was compact, solid, always within reach, and its steel blade, designed to cut into stubborn soil, was strong enough to endure far more than digging. Stories like these rarely appeared in official reports. War records tend to focus on larger strategies and larger machines, but among the soldiers themselves, the reputation of the small E-tool quietly spread. Not as a weapon of war, but as something far more personal. A reminder that survival often depended less on specialized equipment and more on how quickly a human being could adapt the ordinary tools already in their hands. War is often described in terms of movement, advancing lines, retreating armies, machines crossing landscapes. But for the individual soldier, war was often the opposite. Long hours of waiting, moments of stillness broken by sudden uncertainty. And during those quiet stretches, the mind could become the most difficult battlefield of all. American troops in World War II learned quickly that staying mentally steady was just as important as staying physically protected. That's where the entrenching tool played a surprisingly quiet role. It gave soldiers something simple to do with their hands. Digging a foxhole was rarely dramatic. There were no orders shouted, no urgent commands, just a repetitive sound of metal cutting into soil, again and again. Psychologists later described this kind of action as grounding behavior, a repetitive task that helps the brain slow down during moments of stress. Without realizing it, soldiers were doing something similar. The act of digging shifted their focus away from uncertainty, away from the endless questions every soldier carries. What's coming next? How close is danger? How long will this moment last? Instead, their attention moved to something immediate and manageable. The next scoop of dirt, the next small adjustment to the shape of the hole, and slowly the mind began to settle. Veterans would later describe the strange comfort that came from those quiet minutes. Not safety, no one believed war could ever be truly safe, but something close to control. Because when a person shapes the ground beneath them, even slightly, the world stops feeling completely unpredictable. The e-tool didn't eliminate fear, but it gave soldiers a way to work through it, one careful movement at a time. And that quiet psychological benefit turned out to be one of the most powerful tools any soldier could carry. The entrenching tool was never meant to be complicated. In fact, its greatest strength came from the exact opposite: simplicity. During World War II, the United States military had to equip millions of soldiers moving across very different environments: European forests, muddy fields, frozen ground, tropical islands. No single piece of equipment could solve every problem, but the e-tool came surprisingly close. Its design was direct and practical: a strong steel blade, a compact handle, a tool that could be carried easily but still endure constant abuse. And that simplicity made it adaptable. Soldiers used it to dig foxholes in minutes. They cleared debris after artillery strikes. They built small defensive positions along roads and hedgerows. In winter fighting, especially during battles like the Battle of the Bulge, troops even used the edge of the blade to break through frozen soil. But perhaps the most important reason it worked had little to do with engineering. It had to do with philosophy. The U.S. Army placed enormous value on individual initiative. Soldiers were trained not just to follow orders, but to adapt, to look at a situation and use whatever was available to solve the problem in front of them. The e-tool fit perfectly into that mindset. It wasn't a specialized machine with only one purpose. It was a simple object that could become many different tools depending on the situation: a shovel, a pick, a lever, sometimes even a last line of defense. That flexibility made it something more than equipment. It became part of the quiet, problem-solving instinct soldiers carried into battle. And as the war progressed, the small shovel hanging from an American soldier's gear earned a reputation that few people outside the military ever noticed: a reputation for reliability. Because when conditions changed quickly, and they always did, the best tools were often the ones that asked the least from the person using them. When the war ended, the shovel didn't disappear. Rifles changed, tanks evolved, technology surged forward. But the small folding shovel, the same simple tool carried by soldiers in muddy trenches, remained. Not because it was impressive, because it was reliable. Across conflicts, armies continued issuing it. From the frozen forests of Eastern Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, soldiers kept strapping that small piece of metal to their gear. And many veterans would quietly tell the same story: the shovel saved lives. Sometimes it dug a trench just seconds before incoming fire. Sometimes it cut through roots so a foxhole could be finished before nightfall. Sometimes it became a frying pan, a hammer, a pry bar. And sometimes, in the worst moments, it became a weapon. But the deeper lesson of the shovel wasn't about combat. It was about something far more human. War strips life down to the essentials: food, shelter, warmth, survival. In those conditions, the most valuable tools aren't always the most advanced ones. They're the ones that solve many problems at once. A soldier carrying a rifle could fight. A soldier carrying a shovel could survive. Dig protection, build shelter, clear obstacles, stay warm, cook food, defend himself if necessary. One tool, dozens of roles. That's why soldiers trusted it. And that's why the shovel became something more than equipment. It became a symbol of resilience. Because at the end of the day, wars are not only fought with weapons. They're fought with endurance, with creativity, with the stubborn human ability to keep going using whatever tools are available. And sometimes, all that stood between a soldier and the chaos around him was a small folding shovel, a patch of earth, and the determination to keep digging, not to win glory, just to see another sunrise.